أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفلم يسيروا في الأرض فتكون لهم قلوب يعقلون بها أو آذان يسمعون بها فإنها لا تعمى الأبصار ولكن تعمى القلوب التي في الصدور فإنها لا تعمى الأبصار ولكن تعمى القلوب التي في الصدور.
Ready for a deep dive, everybody. Today, we're looking at excerpts you sent in from the article, Construction and Representation of Blindness in the Quran, a reading of selected verses. And we're going to see how this sacred text deals with blindness, maybe in some unexpected ways.
It really is fascinating when you think about it, how a text that's been around for centuries, revered by so many, approaches something like blindness. And what we're going to see is it's not just about, physical sight.
It seems like there's always more than meets the eye, right? So tell us a bit, for our listeners who might not know, what makes the Quran's perspective on this topic so important?
Well, the Quran, it's the central text in Islam.
Yeah.
Believed to be the Word of God. And I don't just mean, religiously important. Muslims turn to it for guidance on, everything. Social interactions, ethical problems, even legal stuff.
So it's a guide for living, basically.
Exactly. So when it talks about disability, in our case, blindness, it has a real impact. I mean, this isn't just theory. It's about how people live their lives.
Right. It's putting those teachings into practice. And one thing that struck me reading that article was how the Quran doesn't just treat blindness as a physical thing.
That's what makes it so interesting. It goes beyond just saying, this is blindness. It explores it literally, metaphorically, even spiritually.
Like we're being encouraged to look deeper. And speaking of looking deeper, the article talked about a story with the Prophet Muhammad and a blind man that led to a revelation in the Quran.
Oh, you mean the story of Abdullah bin Maktoum? That's a key moment. Really shows how the Quran views inclusivity.
So set the scene for us. What happened?
So picture this. The Prophet Muhammad is talking to some really important leaders of the Quraysh tribe, and he's trying to, bring them to Islam. Then he's interrupted by a blind man, Abdullah bin Maktoum, wanting to learn about this new faith.
I can't imagine those tribal leaders were too happy about that.
Right. And the story goes that the prophet, maybe just a natural human reaction, he frowns and turns away. But here's the powerful part. This leads to a divine revelation.
Wow, so this seemingly small thing.
It becomes part of the Quran. Surah Abasa, the first 10 verses, they address this.
That's incredible. What do the verses say?
They're kind of a gentle correction to the prophet, reminding him that seeking knowledge, growing spiritually, it's not limited by physical things.
Yeah, everyone has that potential. That's powerful.
And get this, to emphasize the point, Abdullah bin Maktoum, he becomes a really important figure. He even led prayers in Medina.
Wow, talk about putting your teachings into action. It's like the Quran saying, don't underestimate anyone.
Exactly. And it shows how it lays the groundwork for a society that's inclusive, embracing everyone's potential.
That's so important. So we're seeing inclusion, but what about the practical side? How does this translate to everyday life?
That's where we get into inclusion and reasonable accommodation. These are ideas we see today in disability rights movements, legal stuff, but they're in the Quran centuries earlier.
That's incredible. Are there examples of that?
Absolutely. Take Surah Al-Fatah. It talks about war, right? No. It specifically says that blind and disabled people, they don't have to fight.
I see where you're going with this. It's about recognizing different contributions, right?
You got it. Not everyone's on the front lines. The Quran acknowledges that. It's about making space for those differences, not burdening people unnecessarily. Today, we call that reasonable accommodation, adjusting things so everyone can participate equally.
It's about making things work for everyone. Are there other examples like this, that address the needs of people who can't see?
Another great example, Surah Al-Nur. There's a part about eating, like table manners, and it says it's totally fine for a blind person to eat with family and friends in their homes, even if it bends the social rules back then.
It's recognizing that being included socially is just as important, creating a sense of belonging.
Absolutely. Social interaction, being a part of things, that's vital for everyone. And the Quran gets that. These might seem like little things, but they show a bigger picture. Empathy, understanding. It's about building a society where everyone feels welcome, comfortable.
It's like a sign that says all are welcome here. This is fascinating, but we've mainly focused on literal blindness. What about those metaphorical interpretations the article talked about?
Ah, yes. That's where things get even more interesting. The Quran often uses blindness as a metaphor to represent a lack of spiritual understanding, or even like rejecting truth.
So going beyond just the physical, got any examples?
One powerful one is in Surah Al-Baqarah. It compares those who reject Allah's message to people in darkness after a fire around them goes out. It calls them deaf, dumb, and blind, totally lost.
Wow. So blindness there, it's like being spiritually lost, surrounded by truth but not seeing it.
You got it. And you see this throughout the Quran. Like in Surah Al-Ma'idah, those who reject the prophets are called blind and deaf. Their hearts are hardened.
It's like they could see and hear, but they choose not to.
Exactly. That's the point. It's not about physical inability. It's about willfully closing yourself off, resisting knowledge.
That adds a whole other layer. It's like we're being challenged to look at our own blind spots, where we might be resisting truth or not wanting to see another perspective. But I wonder, doesn't that metaphor risk being misinterpreted, used against people with disabilities?
That's so important, and scholars have debated it for ages. Context is everything. You can't just isolate verses.
Gotta look at the whole picture.
Yes, the broader context, what was happening then, the whole message. When you do that, it's clear the Quran isn't making a literal statement about people with disabilities. It's going deeper.
How do we make sure people don't miss that deeper meaning?
Education, talking about it, that's key. We have to think critically, understand the nuances. It's an ongoing conversation.
You know, it's fascinating that we're talking about blindness, but the Quran's encouraging us to really think, not just take things at face value. I'm seeing this whole topic differently.
Me too. And this is just the beginning. There's so much more to uncover in the Quran.
And speaking of uncovering more, let's dig deeper into how the Quran uses blindness metaphorically when we come back. Don't go anywhere. So we're back, and we're diving deeper into how the Quran uses blindness metaphorically, and like you were saying, how important that context is.
It's really baked into the text, these ways to avoid those surface-level readings. We have to zoom out and see the big picture.
Like assembling a puzzle, you can't just look at one piece. So how do we do that, get the full context with these metaphors?
One way is to look for other metaphors the Quran uses. It's not just blindness. There are these patterns for talking about resisting truth.
Oh, so there's a bigger system at play. I love finding those connections.
Exactly. For example, the Quran uses deafness, even being mute, metaphorically, to show that same closing off spiritually.
You're right. I hadn't thought of that. Any examples come to mind? It really highlights how spotting these patterns can help us understand better.
Definitely. Remember that Surah Al-Baqarah verse about the fire going out? It doesn't just say people become blind. It says deaf, dumb, and blind.
Oh, right. All those senses together, hearing, speech, sight. It creates this intense image of being spiritually lost and isolated.
Exactly. Using all those senses metaphorically, it's emphasizing that this is about a state of being, a choice to shut out knowledge. It's not about a physical lack of ability.
That clears things up. The Quran isn't saying physical blindness equals some spiritual failing.
Not at all. It's about the choices we make. Do we open up to truth, to knowledge, or do we turn away?
That makes me think about something else from the article about the word jihad. How it can mean different things depending on where it appears.
Great parallel. People often translate jihad as holy war, which gives a very specific and sometimes misunderstood idea.
Right, like it's all about physical battles.
Well, jihad can mean fighting to defend the faith. It's way broader than that in Islam.
So how else is jihad understood?
It can be the struggle against your own ego, your desires, temptations. That inner struggle to grow spiritually, be morally better, that's considered by many to be the greater jihad.
So it's a difference between fighting outward battles and the battle to become a better person, conquer your own flaws.
Exactly. Just like with the blindness and deafness metaphors, you have to get the context of jihad to grasp its real meaning.
Context is everything when we're dealing with these big concepts. Otherwise, it's easy to misunderstand and miss what the Quran's truly getting at. Like, we miss the forest for the trees,
Couldn't have said it better. Whether it's blindness, deafness, jihad, the Quran is asking us to think critically, not just take it at face value, but engage with it on these different levels.
I'm really glad we're going beyond just the surface level here. It's giving me a whole new perspective. But I have to ask, with all this talk about metaphors, Are there any parts of the Quran that address blindness more directly, less symbolically?
You're right to bring us back to those literal examples. They're crucial to understanding the Quran's view on blindness in its entirety.
It's like we zoomed out to see the whole map, and now we're looking at the landmarks up close again.
That's a great way to put it. We've been in that metaphorical world, but the Quran also deals with, the real lives of people with disabilities.
It's about action, not just words.
Exactly. And those verses we talked about earlier, Surah Al-Fatah, Surah Al-Lorn, they're great examples. Exemption from war, being flexible with customs, those show a deep understanding of what inclusion means practically.
It's saying, don't just say you value everyone, prove it. And those verses show exactly how to do that.
I agree. They make us think about what real inclusion is, recognizing we don't all experience the world the same way, and those differences are something to accommodate, not ignore.
It's like holding up a mirror to ourselves, asking, are we living up to this?
That's it. And that brings us back to something we touched on. The Quran says every single person has inherent worth, dignity.
So it's not about seeing blindness or any disability as bad or needing to be fixed.
Right. And that's what's so profound here. The Quran's view on blindness, it goes way beyond the physical. We're pushed to see potential unique gifts, no matter what abilities someone does or doesn't have.
It's about a society built on empathy, understanding, and really respecting how different everyone's experience is.
Couldn't have put it better myself. What a journey this has been. We've barely scratched the surface, and look how much we've uncovered.
I know. It all comes back to your question, right? If blindness can mean resisting truth in the Quran, what are our own blind spots? What's stopping us from fully seeing the world, understanding other viewpoints, other ways of being?
That's something to think about, isn't it? It's a call to look inward, question our assumptions, and be open to new ways of seeing things.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for exploring with us, everyone. Catch you next time for another dive into a new topic.